Years ago this week that miners in Elliott Lake walked off the job. They were tired of watching colleagues die from respiratory diseases and cancer. Hundreds of uranium miners stayed out on a wildcat strike for 3 weeks. Now, this was a turning point for worker safety in Ontario. It eventually led to the Occupational Health and Safety Act that we have to this day. And I had a conversation about that legislation that you're going to hear in a few minutes. First, with the help of the CBC's archives, Megan Thomas put together this look back at the Elliott Lake Wildcat Strike of 1974.
At Elliott Lake in Ontario, 700 uranium miners are staging a wildcat strike.
My name's John Perquin. I'm the assistant to the International Secretary-Treasurer for the United Steelworkers. I work out of Pittsburgh. Formerly, I worked in Elliott Lake. Well, it actually goes back to the 50s when Elliott Lake started up. Sometime in the late 50s, there was 1 year where there was a significant number of fatalities that occurred, and a small inquiry took place back at that time. But the industry took a downturn, and so nothing much took effect out of whatever the inquiry was. Then in the 70s, the industry boomed again, and the mines started up again, and a lot of the old miners came back to work. And by 1973, roughly, the men noticed that people were dying of silicosis, they were dying of cancers, and they became quite concerned about it.
The ore in Elliott Lake is very high in silicotic content.
What does the silicotic dust do to the workers?
Silicotic dust is a dust that you can't see. It's finer than that. It embeds itself in the lung tissue, reduces the capacity of the lung to feed oxygen to the bloodstream and to the heart.
So they formed a silicosis committee that went into great depth to examine that whole issue. And they produced a significant report, took it to the employers, and the employers basically told them that there were no real problems, that the dust that they were breathing was just nuisance dust, and it was fine. And that any exposures to radon were not significant, and that they ought not to be concerned about that either.
Provincial Affairs, a free-time political telecast. Tonight's speaker is Stephen Lewis, leader of the New Democratic Party in Ontario.
About 8 days ago, in the little northern Ontario mining community of Elliott Lake, 700 workers walked off the job. They've not yet returned, working in the famous Denison uranium mines. They left because of the conditions in the mine.
Well, they all could have been fired, but for them, their health was more important. So they did. They engaged in the wildcat strike. They had put together a list of, I think it was about 54 concerns. And one of our health and safety experts from the International Union came in to work with the men in Elliott Lake. His name was Paul Falkowski. And he took a look at their list of concerns and decided that this was not just an issue for Elliott Lake. This was an issue that needed to go far beyond Elliott Lake. And so he made contact with Stephen Lewis and Eli Martel.
New Democratic Party member of the Ontario Legislature, Eli Martel, has accused the Ontario Resources Minister, Leo Bernier, of failing to reduce the risks faced by miners of contracting lung disease in uranium mines in Elliott Lake.
And so, the ministry stands condemned. If they were warned in 1961...
It was 3 weeks before the strike finally ended, and the men went back to work, knowing that the company would sit down and cooperate with the government. And the HAM Commission was struck, and it began to examine health and safety conditions in the mining industry at that time.
Grim details about Elliott Lake workers who contracted the dreaded lung disease silicosis continue to pour out of northern Ontario.
It's something you can't buy with money. Not if you give me $1 million, I couldn't buy my lung back. I know what I know now. You couldn't get me into uranium mining.
The HAM Commission published its report in 1976. It made 117 recommendations. Of those recommendations, a number of them had been submitted by the steelworkers, and prominent amongst those were the need to enforce through legislation the right to participate, the right to refuse, the right to know, the right to have joint health and safety committees, to have joint health and safety committees conduct investigations in the workplace. And those all found their way by way of recommendation into the Ham Commission's report. And eventually the Occupational Health and Safety Act was passed in 1978. They were fighting for their own issues. I still talk to some of them today who are alive, and never in their wildest imagination did they ever believe or think that it was going to have such amazing impact.
A look back at the 1974 wildcat strike in Elliott Lake from our CBC archives. And our thanks to the CBC's Megan Thomas for putting that together. You heard also the voice of steelworker John Perkin, who one of the organizers of this week's commemoration. The Steelworkers Union is holding several events in Elliott Lake today to commemorate the 40th anniversary of the strike, including a mock picket at the entrance to the former Denison mine. They will be rededicating the Miners' Memorial as well. Now, to talk about how far we've come since the Occupational Health and Safety Act was created in 1978, we have Tammy Eager in studio. She's director of the Center for Research in Occupational Safety and Health at Laurentian University. Good morning.
Good morning, Marcus.
So how significant was the Occupational Health and Safety Act for all workers, not just miners?
Well, I think you can hear from that documentary that it was really a groundbreaking moment. It changed the course of health and safety in the province. And it really created the foundation for how health and safety has continued to be viewed as critically important for workplace safety.
I think younger workers probably take it for granted now, but 2 generations ago, conditions weren't great, were they?
Absolutely. When we think about our young workers in the workplace, health and safety is now being taught in schools. It's being taught in curriculum at the university level. And I think even important to that, some of the new changes that have happened in the legislation will now make mandatory health and safety required for all workers, and that's going to be happening July 1st of this year.
Yeah, this year everyone has to take a course, don't they, as of July 1st?
Absolutely. So, and that's going to be very important for workers that perhaps before maybe been less informed because of being perhaps in smaller workplaces, some of our immigrant workers coming into the province. So this way, it doesn't matter whether you're working in a coffee shop that might have 5 or 6 people, or you're working in a mine where you've got thousands of workers. There will be a basic mandatory health and safety training required for everyone.
Do you know what's in that course?
It is basic. I mean, and in some ways it does cover some of the key points that were discussed in that documentary. So for the workers, for example, to know what the Occupational Health and Safety Act is and that it exists, some of the core foundations, so the fact that you do have the right to refuse work if that work is unsafe. Talks a little bit again about responsibility, and one of the core features of the Occupational Health and Safety Act is the internal responsibility system.
Is the Act good the way it stands? Are there areas that need improvement?
I think that that will, depending on who you ask, there'll always be arguments for improvement, and I think just like anything, there is always reflection on what can we do better. But I think the core principles of the Act and then the regulations that go with that, depending on what industry you're working with, do set up the potential for everyone to work safely. But it's important that the Act is followed, and in some cases we do need enforcement, so to make sure that people are following the rules that are set out, or the regulations.
Whose job is it to enforce it?
I guess at the core, it's the Ministry of Labor is responsible for enforcement. But if we go back to the tenets of sort of this internal responsibility system, health and safety is our responsibility. It's everybody's responsibility. And so what that says is that it doesn't matter whether you're the CEO of that company or whether you're a student just hired for the summer. It's everyone's responsibility to protect not only yourself, but to protect your coworker. So if we see something that's unsafe, we can take this morning, for example, see that somebody's gone by and has put sand down in front of the steps for CBC. But if you were to go out this morning for your radio report and you saw that it was all icy entering your workplace,
it's my job.
You would want to take care of that. And maybe not yourself, but you'd let somebody know so that you didn't leave that for somebody else to have a slip accident.
Yeah, because if we relied on the Ministry of Labour, all it would be is after the fact, after someone's hurt, after someone's killed on the job.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's a lot of proactive work happening in the province as well. There has been the creation of the Chief Prevention Officer. There's been some restructuring of the health and safety agencies within the province, and everyone is trying to work to be proactive. But of course, there's still the potential that something could get missed. And again, if we're all looking out for each other and thinking safety as the number one priority, then we're more likely to have that safe workplace.
There is a review underway of the mining sector here in Ontario. Do you expect we're going to see changes to health and safety legislation as a result of that?
It's hard to say. Possibly there could be some changes to the legislation. There could be changes to the regulations that are directed towards mining and mine plants. There could be some changes that come that will perhaps just reflect in terms of training requirements. There could be some changes in terms of research and investing in and trying to understand some of these more complex problems within the workplace. So I think we'll have to wait to see how that panel, the report comes. But I know there's still an opportunity for people to contribute to that in terms of a written response. And absolutely any of the listeners today, if they have anything from a personal experience or things they've heard from others or from the job that they're doing, they can make recommendations to that panel and that information will be considered.
But no doubt this province is a lot different than it was 40 years ago to work in.
Absolutely. And I think when we think back to the courage that those workers had to stand up for their health and safety and the health and safety of their co-workers, I think it's tremendous that we're recognizing that today.
Thanks so much for coming in this morning.
Thank you.
Tammy Eager, Director of the Centre for Research in Occupational Safety and Health at Laurentian University in Sudbury.